possess and control many of the corrupt world leaders who engage in pedophilia and ritual murder for the same reason. Having access to precise genealogical records, they know who to seek out as victims, those innocent that are of the Lemurian bloodline specifically. This is the answer to much of what lies behind the exposés of Kathy O'Brien, Arizona Wilder, Bryce Taylor, and others who have come forth to reveal what they have seen and experienced behind the corridors of power. The hybrid reptilians were created to seek out and destroy the Lemurians on behalf of their alien masters. This was like their day job. This process has not ceased in ancient times, but still goes on today. Now we come full circle to examine what has happened more distinctly in our own times. We don't have time in one presentation or even in a series of presentations to delineate and examine every single machination of these entities in the last 11,000 years. But we can look at a few that are specific to our own times. Now, when the pursuers of the Nephilim destroyed the planet Tiamat, they made haste to leave our solar system to avoid the cosmic upheavals created by their action. However, for some reason, they took extraordinary precautions to prevent their enemies, should they be still alive on our planet, from ever leaving. They erected a powerful energy barrier around our entire planet. This enveloping shield still exists, and no one on Earth can physically break through or go beyond it. Now, earlier we saw that the Nephilim arrived on our planet not by their own free will. They arrived here approximately 50,000 years ago, and the subsequent pole shift and the War of the Gods occurred about 13,005 years from our present age. Now, the Nephilim arrived in our solar system after being expurged from their own planetary systems, wherever those may be. I tend to think that that was Draco, the constellation of Draco, or Alpha Draconis perhaps. They arrived here not of their own free will, and the pursuers, after destroying Tiamat, had to make haste to leave, because we don't drive our car through an earthquake by choice, do we? But before they left, they erected a membrane and etheric barrier around our Earth just as a quarantine measure, in order to make sure that just in case the Nephilim, their hated nemesis, were on this planet, that they could never again leave to spread their evil elsewhere in the galaxy or the universe. That barrier is the true Stargate. So when we hear about that term, the Stargate, we should realize that it also has historical precedence, and it's up there. A shield or a barrier around the Earth, and the mythologies talk about it. The ancient scriptures talk about this barrier around the Earth. It's part technology, but it's also part etheric energy, far in advance of our own science today. In the Pistis Sophia, one of the most ancient Gnostic texts, it says, "The outer darkness is a huge dragon, whose tail is in its mouth." And that was the symbol that has come down to us from mythology to illustrate this particular encircling field of energy. The serpent with a tail in its own mouth, which is called the Ouroboros, the encircling dragon. You'll often see symbols of the dragon encompassing a globe or something of great price, like a pearl or a diamond. The Native American Indians have often referred to it as the great web in the sky. And we might wonder about, again, modern symbolism. And who knows what. Here we have the symbol for the United Nations with the earth with a strange grid and the Roman laurel leaves encircling it. In Revelation 8, we read, "And the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key to the bottomless pit." In the epistle of Peter, "God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them into the chains of darkness, to be reserved unto judgment." So we're hearing in these scriptures that the earth and the internment is described as a bottomless pit in which the Lord has interned the dark ones, that they beings can enter into our Earth atmosphere or through the membrane, but the Nephilim specifically, any entity with the alien DNA simply cannot go beyond this barrier. They're contained here until the time of the judgment. Now, the assassinated researcher and theorist Bill Cooper writes, "No man has ever ascended higher than 300 miles, if that high, above the Earth's surface. No man has ever orbited, landed on, or walked upon the moon in any publicly known space program. If man has ever truly been to the moon, it has been done in secret and with a far different technology. The tremendous radiation encountered by the Van Allen belt, solar radiation, cosmic radiation, temperature control, and many other problems connected with space travel prevent living organisms leaving our atmosphere with our known level of technology. Any intelligent high school student with a basic physics book can prove NASA faked the Apollo moon landings. If you doubt this, please explain how the astronauts walked upon the moon's surface enclosed in a spacesuit in full sunlight, absorbing a minimum of 265 degrees of heat, surrounded by a vacuum." So this piece of controversial information is in fact the truth. You cannot go to the moon. The Stargate is connected with the orbit of the moon, like the moon may be the lodestone or the lock. And the orbit of the moon is in some way connected to what keeps this Stargate active. So you can go to the moon. You could actually go to the moon, but you couldn't go beyond it. And as Bill Cooper is saying here, because of the radiation and our level of technology, it is a fallacy that we've even gone to the moon. Here, from all cultures again, the Ouroboros, the encircling dragon. Always in its clutches, in its protection, is the pearl of great price. Here the artist is actually showing the dragon encircling the world. And of course, again, we have the old mythological motif of the hero slaying the dragon. Now we can understand that in slaying the dragon, there's also a tie-in to leaving the earth, being able to be free to explore the heavens. So in slaying the dragon, it's opening the Stargate. There's a connection now between these two paradigms, carefully disguised in mythology and in folktale, but with an incredible celestial meaning behind it. Now, research has demonstrated that some 30,000 years ago, a highly developed civilization existed in the Andes, and also that the Earth's moon was not there at the time. This supports the evidence which suggests that the moon is not a natural satellite, but an artificial construction parked there some thousands of years ago. That's not as far-fetched as it seems, because of all the planets in our solar system, our moon is vastly bigger. The moons of Saturn and the moons of Uranus or whatever planet are minuscule. They are actually true satellites. Very, very small. Our moon is more like a small planetoid. It's vastly bigger than the other moons of other planets. Michel de Nostradamus, the famous French clairvoyant, says, "He will come to take himself to the corner of Luna, where he will be taken and placed on alien land." Then we have the Lunar Society. Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles Darwin. Erasmus Darwin was the founder of the Lunar Society. The group's name owed itself to the fact that the members met monthly at the time of the full moon. The membership boasted such luminaries as John Wilkinson, who made cannons, James Watt, who owed his notoriety to the steam engine, Matthew Boulton, a manufacturer, Joseph Priestley, a chemist, Josiah Wedgwood, who founded the famous pottery business, and Benjamin Franklin, no less. So here we have some of the most illustrious scientists and inventors and politicians, and they all belong to this society known as the Lunar Society and make a point of meeting at the time of the moon. Well, hold on. I thought scientists refute all such occult principles. Virtually all the Royal Society founding members, says Michael Bagent, were Freemasons. One could reasonably argue that the Royal Society itself, at least in its inception, was a Masonic institution. And when we do our homework, we find out that the Lunar Society was the prelude or the predecessor to what later became the Royal Society. The Royal Society grew out of an occult organization. In England, we have the organization known as the Hellfire Club, created by Sir Francis Dashwood, the famous Satanist. But Dashwood was also the Chancellor of the Exchequer of the Government of England. Other members were the son of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Potter, the Earl of Sandwich, who was also a member of the House of the Lords, the Marquis of Bute, who became the Prime Minister of England, Charles Churchill, John Wilkes, and George Bob Doddington, another member of the Cabinet. And the Hellfire Club is a known satanic enclave. The moon landing of July 20th, 1969, the so-called moon landing. But what is not widely known is that alongside the national flag, Buzz Aldrin also carried a Masonic banner. This has been embroidered especially for his strange journey by the librarian of the Masonic House of the Temple in Washington, D.C. That's right. So here we have the cameras rolling when we have the official flag of the United States being positioned on the moon. But hold on, half an hour before, we've got this whole Masonic ceremony. Well, wait a minute, I thought this was a free country, and there's meant to be freedom of the press. How come we weren't privy to that one? How come the moon is even being dedicated to some strange occult fraternity before it's being dedicated to the American people? So whether you believe there was an actual visitation to the moon or the whole thing was staged, either way, even in a staged event, the proclaiming of the moon in a ritualistic way should raise some very serious questions here. And of course, we have the strange phraseology that from beginning to end of the Apollo missions, we have this strange, bizarre phraseology which NASA has never satisfactorily explained. One of the most obvious and most heard euphemisms, of course, is the eagle has landed. And everyone associated that with the eagle symbol of America. But in fact, the eagle is a Masonic symbol, because it is really, what is being referred to is really the double eagle of Freemasonry and not the bald eagle of America. The double eagle is a very famous symbol of Freemasonry. It was originally the emblem of the Habsburg dynasty of Europe, a very powerful set of oligarchs and royalty that still exist and are responsible for innumerable wars and dynastic rivalries. Now in the Quran, chapter 9:11 no less, it says, "For it is written that a son of Arabia would awaken a fearsome eagle. The wrath of the eagle would be felt throughout the lands of Allah." Now, as I said earlier, we have not got the time to deal with all the sundry historical machinations from the last 11,000 years. But one particular period, one particular epoch that should concern us is what we know today historically as the Renaissance. About the time of the 15th century, as they were congratulating themselves on their progress, the alien bureaucracy discovered the presence of the Stargate. They had to face the fact that even if all their technological hardware was successfully reconstructed, they still could not vacate the planet Earth, which had been placed under quarantine. So here we have it. Hundreds, thousands of years are going by. The alien progeny have understood that yes, all the technological hardware that they once had created and had brought here to the planet Earth, which may have even included spacecrafts and all sorts of cybernetic technologically advanced devices, all of it, or a good deal of it, has been destroyed. So here they are, spending 11,000 years moving mankind gradually, manipulating every phase of history, putting whole nations under the swords, stretching their empire out to encompass the whole of the globe, mining and enslaving the whole human race in order to slowly, incrementally push the technology further to the point where they can restore some of this. And that accounts for why in the world, for 11,000 years, we've been so sexually and genetically and genderally and emotionally and psychologically arrested, while we're so super technologically advanced. But they've realized, after they discover the Stargate, that now, even if they manage to succeed in phase one, the Stargate exists. They're in quarantine. Perhaps they'll never be able to leave after all. And they probably found this out the hard way. A very huge and puzzling meteorite fell thunderously in Soviet Siberia on July 30th, 1908. Peasants heard the awesome explosion as far as 620 miles away. A large area of forest was flattened as if an immense object had fallen. No remnants of the alleged meteorite could be found anywhere underground. Radioactivity had initially been released in enormous amounts. The general destruction showed that the energy released had been far greater than the mere impact of a falling stone, no matter how huge. Most significantly, the aerial path of the falling object had not been uniform, but had amazingly changed during descent. Various Soviet scientists then put forward an amazing theory, that it had been a spaceship driven by intelligent beings and loaded with a great power from a nuclear power plant, which had exploded through some accident. Well, if you go along with the theories we're advancing here, we can edit this statement slightly. From the Renaissance, and probably before, through this process of pushing mankind forward, the alien progeny of Atlantis, their descendants, of course, probably were able to build some rudimentary spacecrafts. And it was through taking these up into the ionosphere that they discovered the presence of the Stargate. And perhaps crashing right into it, these spaceships would then fall back to Earth in the way just described here. So it's not that we should understand this as spaceships coming into our solar system and then entering into our Earth atmosphere and then mysteriously veering and careering out of control and crashing into the Russian forests. It can hardly be said that those who've got the ability to cross hyperspace would then enter into our planetary space and lose control of their spacecrafts. Something doesn't sit quite right with that story. More likely, Earth ships are making journeys into the ionosphere in order to penetrate the barrier and can't do so, and then perhaps they lose control and fall back to Earth. But undaunted by this discovery, the alien progeny decide to press ahead. They put their greatest intellectuals onto the problem to see if a solution could be found, believing that what technology could erect, technology could take down. The major dynasties of the planet underwrote occultists, scholars, scientists, and philosophers to work on the Stargate problem. Elaborate efforts were also made to cover up the existence of the real opus. The perfect covers came to be that of both science and occultism. It was so effective that even today, most students and practitioners of both science and magic are unaware of the practical importance of their work and to whom it is really of benefit. Those of the inner sanctums also adopt clever cover acts and stories in order to be able to work undetected. Fronts are utilized by all major criminal syndicates, and it is no different with the children of the Nephilim, who have a great deal to hide from public view. And at this point, we should remark that, of course, when we talk about the Atlantean progeny, we're not talking about the originals. These beings from other worlds with a pure alien DNA, and perhaps even some of their progeny, those with human and alien DNA, live for extended periods of time. There's reports that the original alien warlocks could live for up to 700 years, but they are not eternal and do in fact die. So the Atlantean progeny, the bloodline that we're talking about, are descendants of the original warlocks of Atlantis. We can surmise that none of the original warlocks exist, although some accounts say that they do. So who are the new Atlanteans? And how would we identify them? Well, we've got strange personalities all over history. Open any history book and faces stare out of you of Machiavelli, Nostradamus, all these bizarre creatures and characters and the dramatis personae of history. Interestingly, here we have a picture of Rasputin, the Russian warlock. Well, the word Grigory means in Greek the fallen one or the fallen angel. And of course, Rasputin was the devil responsible for the destruction of the Romanov dynasty in Russia. But we can speculate that the great kings have the alien blood, and perhaps even some of the popes. And it's not so far-fetched when you start reading some of their biographies and penchants for slaughter and abuse. We have in English mythology William the Conqueror, of course, the Norman king who brought such destruction and mayhem to England. In fact, so bad it was that the people of England referred to his reign as Doomsday. This is the term that the Saxon English used for the seizure of their land and the subsequent taxation, which was hitherto relatively unknown. William the Conqueror brought the pyramidical organizational structure to feudal England. But just before he died, and I mean a matter of days before William died, he had this to say: I have persecuted its native inhabitants beyond all reason. Whether gentle or simple, I have cruelly oppressed them. Many I unjustly disinherited. Innumerable multitudes, especially in the country of York, perished through me by famine or the sword. Having therefore made my way to the throne of that kingdom by so many crimes, I dare not leave it to anyone but God alone, lest after my death worse should happen by my means. And of course, no Irish person on the planet can forget the scorched earth policy of Oliver Cromwell, who literally murdered thousands of Irish people in an all-out blitzkrieg. The 14th century Plantagenet King Richard II, one of the most unpredictable of English kings, after the unsuccessful Peasants' Revolt, he declared this to his Saxon underlings, and these are his own words: God omnipotent is mustering in his clouds on our behalf armies of pestilence, and they shall strike your children yet unborn and unbegot, that lift your vassal hands against my head and threat the glory of my precious crown. You wretches, detestable on land or sea, you will seek equality with lords and are unworthy to live. Give this message to your colleagues. Rustics you were, and rustics you are still. You will remain in bondage, not as before, but incomparably harsher. For as long as we live, we will strive to suppress you, and your misery will be an example for posterity. However, we will spare your lives if you remain faithful. Choose now which course you want to follow. This is the refrain of the kings of all of the world. This is the kings, the potentates, the nobles, and the lords. You only have to listen to what they have to say. Now, the most powerful dynasty that enjoyed direct descent from the Atlantean bloodkin was the Tudor dynasty of England. The word Tudor comes from the word tutor, meaning the teachers, that is, the educated ones, those with knowledge. The leader of the Tudor dynasty during this period was called the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth Tudor, Elizabeth I, literally, she who must be obeyed. Here we have that term virgin again also, which one should note. The Virgin Queen. And the symbol of the Tudors was the famous rose, the Tudor rose. And this is why, for instance, there is a rose garden near every government office or government central headquarters. And we have the War of the Roses, of course, in historical terms in England. The father of Elizabeth I was the famous Henry VIII, Henry Tudor. Queen Elizabeth I was put in charge of the problem of the Stargate, and as such she employed several different people. At the head of these individuals, she placed the man on the left, who is known as Sir John Dee. And Sir John Dee's helper on this problem was Edward Kelly, the Irish clairvoyant. John Dee, Dr. John Dee, is the creator of Enochian magic. Note that word Enochian, because Enoch, of course, is one of the prophets of the Old Testament. But the word Enoch also means the inner eye, or the initiated ones. So Enochian magic is nothing more than the magic of the high ones, the magic of the initiated ones. And through Enochian magic, John Dee believed he could talk to the angels. Now, if we go to the actual book of Enoch, after which the word Enochian comes, the prophet Enoch had this to say in the very opening passage of his book: "The words of the blessing of Enoch, wherewith he blessed the elect and righteous, who will be living in the day of tribulation, when all the wicked and the godless are to be removed. And he took up his parable and said, Enoch, a righteous man, whose eyes were opened by God, saw the vision of the Holy One in the heavens, which the angel showed me. And from them I heard everything, and from them I understood as I saw, but not for this generation, but for a remote one, which is for to come." So Enoch is prophesying our times again, the days of tribulation. It turns out that this mysterious master astrologer and court official and ambassador, Sir John Dee, was also the head of MI5, the British Secret Service. It's the first secret service that ever existed. The first secret police existed in Tudor England and was created by John Dee. And when John Dee used to go on occasion to visit the royal houses of other countries, and when he'd write back to his mistress, she who must be obeyed, Elizabeth I, he'd always sign at the bottom of his documents 007. That was the sigil of the head of the MI5 of those days. Now, of course, that is later picked up in the stories of Ian Fleming, and the reason for that is because Ian Fleming himself was a member in more modern times of the British Secret Service. And what better upon retirement than to write about his own organization? So the 007, the original, way back at the time of the Tudor dynasty, was Sir John Dee, Master Occultist. And if you study the symbol for MI5, you'll notice that it has a triangular pyramidical shape with the crown of the Queen, and it has a eye, the Enochian eye, at the northern apex. Now, John Dee was one of the most powerful black magicians in history. He decided that it would be better to contact pan-dimensional intelligences to solve their little problem of quarantine. Via his system of magic and divination, he succeeded in opening a portal to these fourth-dimensional entities, or oversouls. Dee became a living macroscope. This was not the first time in history where such a forbidden rite was undertaken, and every time it does occur, it has the severest repercussions from history. So John Dee, being a master occultist and connected throughout the world, he looked into this problem and decided that there wasn't any normal technological or scientific way that they were going to be able to find this key, so to speak, to the Stargate. But he said he could use his occult power. So with Edward Kelly and all the other occultists of Europe, in combination, in concert, they decided to call on what are known in the occult world as pan-dimensional oversouls, beings that are above our level of consciousness. Not necessarily more pure or more spiritual, but of a higher spiritual intelligence, let's say. The oversouls. Later writers have called these entities the macrobes. This word comes from the fact that there are beings, creatures, entities below us who are called the microbes, and it takes a microscope to see them. Before the advent of the microscope, if anyone had told you that there's all sorts of little creatures and little entities, but you just can't see them, we would have thought they were crazy and probably burned them at the stake as being heretics. But as soon as we have the right instrument, we look through it and we're able to see a whole world, a whole ecostructure of microbes and bacteria and viruses and whatnot. Well, above the level of the human consciousness are the macrobes. And as yet, there's no instrument per se in order to see it. But there is an instrument, and that instrument is known as the human intuition. It's through the human intuition, the human imagination, that one can make contact with the macrobes. John Dee did make contact with the macrobes. In fact, he became what might be described as a living macroscope. Now, in short, Dee was told that there were two cardinal premises which needed to be mastered before the Stargate could be opened. The first precept concerned creating matter from energy, but that would have to be revealed in two main stages. And the second concerned the properties of a certain element, and that element was silicon. Now, phase one concerned creating matter from energy, but as the macrobes instructed John Dee, the human race was way too primitive for that. That phase one would have to be taught to them in two stages. Part one would be to learn how to do the exact reverse, release energy from matter. And then after that, they would be taught how to create matter from energy. And phase one of that was accomplished on July 16th, 1945, at Alamogordo, or the Trinity experiment, when the atomic bomb was released. So the splitting of the atom was phase A of phase one, being able to release energy from matter. Later on, after that period, from the period of 1945, we would start to see experiments which would work on the rest. So MIT, SRI, Hoover Institute, and so on. These organizations are merely fronts for this experimentation, looking at how to now manipulate matter and create it from energy. Phase two was the silicon revolution. the properties of silicon. And of course we know that silicon is created or is a gateway to the computer age. Silicon makes computing possible. And we're told that technology makes life easier. These are the cover stories that let us buy into some of this stuff. If Grandma can do her shopping on the internet, and we could talk over the internet and buy our VCRs, most people are happy and don't think of any of the occult reasons behind the creations of these powerful instruments. Now, one of the greatest New Atlanteans, other than John Dee and Elizabeth I and the Tudors, was Sir Francis Bacon. A Knight Templar, a major occultist, Sir Francis Bacon was appointed Solicitor General and Chief Advisor to the British Crown on June 25, 1607. He conceived the idea of reactivating various secret societies, and in 1580 he founded the secret Rosa Cross Literary Society and the Lodge of Free and Accepted Speculative Masons. Bacon is said to have been introduced to the 33rd degree system into Masonry from the original Templar 9 degrees. So Bacon introduced the 33rd degree system into Freemasonry. For 1 year he had in his possession the first English translations of the Bible. In fact, he was the first major editor of what would become the King James Bible. He also added secret information into the Bible which was not there before. And William T. Smedley, who is a biographer of Francis Bacon, said, "It will eventually be proved that the whole structure of the authorized Bible was Francis Bacon's. He was an ardent student, not only of the Bible, but also of early manuscripts." So Francis Bacon was yet another one of the great thinkers and intelligences that was put onto the problem of the Stargate. He was directly working for the Tudor dynasty. In Talisman, by Graham Hancock and Robert Bivall, they write, "Bacon was a passionate exponent of Britain's colonialization and development of its recently acquired North American territory of Virginia. In 1606, the so-called Virginia Company, there's that word again, Virginia Company was granted a royal charter by James I, which allowed it virtually unlimited power of government in the colony. Bacon had been instrumental in the creation of the charter. Bearing this in mind, it is not surprising that in New Atlantis, Bacon refers to Benasalem as the Virgin of the world." That's right. Francis Bacon wrote 2 very important books that all scientists know. The first one was called The New Atlantis, and the other, The Nouveau Organum, the New Organism. The New Organism and The New Atlantis. Now, Sir John Dee worked closely with his confederates all over the globe. The information transmitted by the macrobes was done cryptically and was voluminous. He realized that many centuries would have to elapse before even the basics could be realized. He also knew how inefficient and counterproductive it was going to be to have separate genius types working in their private garrets all over the planet. The knowledge could not be collated efficiently in this way. So he and his masters devised a scheme to have the scholars come to one place to work and amass the knowledge. These places we know as the universities. And that's right. John Dee realized that it was going to be unproductive to have all these different scholars and occultists and eccentrics and whatnot working in all sorts of corners of the world. Better to bring them all into centralized locations. That's what the word college means. The word college means collage, where many can come together. And of course, there's the silicon connection now fully understood. We've moved on even from the time of universities. Universities can collate. Yes, they can collate in libraries. You can have papers. You can have documents. But soon even that becomes so voluminous. Even that becomes open and privy. Now you can introduce hierarchies. You can introduce fraternity structures into the university system so that, again, you police people and only the purest can ascend through the ranks to find out what the real agenda is. But even that, in the end, can become a problem. The computer is the miniature university with unlimited data storage space. So here we have a tie-in from the silicon idea and the carbon life forms. because the internet promises you also worldwide communication. It's a virtual library, an endless space for archival storage. Now, another level of information that the macrobes had transmitted to John Dee, and what he also realized from his interactions with these supernatural beings, was that in order to even move along with this process, it was going to take hundreds of years. And in fact, from what he was receiving from them, he realized that they would have to subjugate the whole planet in order to not only continue to move the technology forward, but in order to get the element silicon and be able to process it, the whole of the planet would have to be subjugated. And therefore it is from that time, it is from the time of the 15th and 16th and 17th century that we have all the idioms we associate with England. We have the rising of the great navies. We have the rising of empire. We have the rising of the first stock exchanges. And we have the rising of the colonial impulse. A tiny little nothing country, England, where 100 or 200 years before the kings were shivering in windowless castles, literally shivering, couldn't even get the taxes together to fight their neighbors. And suddenly we have empires beginning, empires starting, the great proliferation of what we now know to be the British Empire. And of course, in the vanguard of this were the beings that we know as the pirates, or the pirates, because the word pirates actually means the men of fire. These were direct agents of the Tudor dynasty. The heads of the pirates were the top officials of the pirates. The leaders of most of the pirates were the top brass of the Tudor dynasty, trained in the finest universities, even the fine maritime universities. And one of the greatest leaders of them all was Sir Francis Drake. And of course the word Drake actually means the dragon. San Francisco Bay was originally called Drake's Bay. The pirates, or the pirates, the men of fire, serving the Tudor dynasty, were headed by men like Sir Francis Drake and Edmund Spenser. He was the great-grandfather or the ancestor of Lady Diana Spenser. The progeny of the pirates settled on the lands that they conquered and opened the great universities for the education of their sons and daughters. They employed the fraternity structure to ensure that only the chosen would be exposed to the real occult history of the world and to their role as the future leaders and thinkers, overworld and underworld figures, educated and funded to adroitly lead the rest of mankind down whatever roads became necessary. In the tarot cards, for instance, the devil card is number 15. And we have the old pirate motto, 15 men on a dead man's chest, yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. But the occult history of the pirates has really never been told. And of course the famous symbol of the pirates was the skull and crossbones, a symbol known to be used before them by the Knights of Malta and the Knights Templars or other occult fraternities. And the job of the pirates was to bring mayhem and disease and slaughter to all the lands that they colonized. These were agents of the British Crown and not, as the Errol Flynn movies of the swashbuckling buccaneers tries to show you, some romantic heroes. These people were cutthroats and they had an agenda to be sent out to all the corners of the world and to massacre whoever they found there. It's important to bring out at this time that the macrobes don't work for free. Though John Dee was successful in contacting them, and though the macrobes did transmit a great deal of information that he desired concerning the quarantine and Stargate problem, they don't work for nothing. And John Dee was soon to find out what it was that they wanted in exchange for their services. What they wanted has had the severest consequences for the future of mankind. The macrobes basically told him that what they wanted was blood. Blood has some very specific occult properties, and that's what the macrobes wanted. And John Dee, his reply was, how much do you want and when do you want it? Whatever it takes. This thing is already going to take us hundreds of years. Whatever you need for that information, you will get it. And so John Dee literally put the whole of the human race up in a great black magic mass, a great rite to his overlords, the oversouls that were asking him for payment, literally, in blood. Now, blood happens to be the second commonest word in the Bible after God. And Erich Fromm, the scholar, the German scholar, says, at a deep archaic level, blood is very peculiar substance. Quite generally, it has been equated with life and the life force, and is one of the three sacred substances that emanate from the body. The other two are semen and milk. Semen expresses male, while milk expresses female or motherly creativity, and both were considered sacred in many cults and rituals. Blood transcends the difference between the male and the female. In the deepest level of experience, one magically seizes the life force itself by shedding blood. Now, of course, we looked at earlier just how bloodthirsty the Nephilim had already been, and the progeny and the empires that came out of the Middle East. We know, and we've looked at how bloodthirsty and how warlike and rapacious those races and nations have already been. And now we're being put, the whole human race is being put up in a pact to some oversouls. Could that explain some of the calamities that we've endured since John Dee's time? Well, we've had inquisitions old and new. One of the most atrocious human beings ever to be on this planet, Joseph de Maistre, in his St. Petersburg's dialogues, has this to say: all grandeur, power, all subordination to authority rests on the executioner. He is the horror and the bond of human association. Remove this incomprehensible agent from the world, and at that very moment, order gives way to chaos, thrones topple, and society disappears. Lust for the spilling of human blood is a touchstone of the synarchist mindset. Take the 19th century Spanish Catholic counter-revolutionary ideologue Juan Donoso Cortés, who argued that human sacrifice is the most universal of all human institutions. I say, gentlemen, that dictatorship in certain circumstances, such as those in which we find ourselves, for example, is a legitimate form of government. Dictatorship, indeed, is part of the divine order. The meanest reptile, which I would trample under my feet, would seem less despicable to me than man. The point of faith which most oppresses and weighs upon my reason is that of the nobility and dignity of the human species. So let's not say that it's far-fetched that certain individuals walking this planet think of the human being, as Cortés is saying here, lowlier than the humble reptile. And it even causes them great distress to think of the nobility of the human creature. Such is in the minds of the progeny of the warlocks of Atlantis. Cortés goes on to say the culmination of Donoso's philosophical treatise is that the institution of bloody sacrifice is the most universal of all human dogmas and institutions. The most civilized nations and the most savage tribes believe in a pure victim offered as a perfect holocaust, he wrote. Without the death penalty, without the purifying efficacy of blood, all societal bonds would collapse. Since the first day of the first effusion of blood, it has never ceased to flow, and it has never been shed in vain. Mankind has always believed in three things with an unconquerable faith: that the effusion of blood is necessary, that there is a manner of shedding blood which is purifying, and another mode which is condemnatory. History clearly attests these truths. It presents to us the narrative of cruel acts, of bloody conquests, of the overflow and destruction of famous cities, of atrocious murders committed, of pure victims offered on blood-stained altars, of brothers warring against brothers, of the rich oppressing the poor, and fathers tyrannizing over their children, until the earth appears to us like an immense sea of blood, which neither the piercing breath of the winds can dry up, nor the scorching rays of the sun can absorb. Well, in Russia, 10 million soldiers are said to have died, including 10 million civilians. In Germany, 3 million soldiers and 500,000 civilians. The death toll is awesome. The total of human lives lost in the Second World War is 18,200,000 soldiers and 16,300,000 civilians, for a grand total of 34 million deaths. And of course, in 1918, just after the war, the Spanish flu epidemic killed 20 million when the war killed 10. And in the Second World War, the Spanish flu killed even more men than the war did. Now, students of black magic, students of occultism, as well as the practitioners also know that not only the killing of the victim is important, but also the time of the slaying and also the place. These are also important factors in any kind of ritual associated with black magic or occultism. And John Dee knew the same thing. Being a master occultist and being internationally connected, he understood that the slaughter of mankind, the sacrifice, the offerings to his dark oversouls, had to be also orchestrated correctly. Otherwise, that energy could not be correctly received. The cortisol or whatever properties of the blood, the energy that it contains, could not be properly received unless the deaths occurred in a ritualistic way. So just like the average common or garden Satanist has to draw his circle or create his altar to slaughter his victim, so in the same way do the ritual centers need to be fashioned. And in the same way as the universities were used to coalesce all the scholars, so instead of bringing victims to a site of slaughter, why not have them live in the center of the rite? Now we call these centers of sacrifice cities. The great cities of the world are in fact nothing more than ritual centers designed for the purpose of a massive Holocaust. In David Oveson's monumental work, The Secret Architecture of Our Nation's Capital, we find that there are no less than 23 complete zodiacs in the city of Washington, D.C. And there are over 1,000 zodiacal and planetary symbols embedded into that city. In London, there's 4. So in Washington, D.C., we have 23. That's 19 more than anywhere else in the world. Complete zodiacs secreted into the architecture of Washington, D.C. Now, why would that be? We also find from Oveson's book and also from Talisman by Graham Hancock that every laying of the cornerstones, the rites and rituals, and the founding of the Capitol building and the Library of Congress and all the places of government were meticulously and ritualistically done by Freemasons. David Oveson writes, in the years following the Revolution, the Masonic fraternities held ceremonial layings for such new enterprises as bridges, locks, universities, government buildings, state houses, memorials, and even churches. Such buildings were aligned with the stars and with the spiritual beings who ruled the stars. There may be no doubt, he says, that astrology played an important role in the choice of the key monuments for the laying down of the federal city. Even so, we are reduced to speculation as to which individual or group of individuals was behind this extraordinary undertaking. So David Oveson is a scholar who's understood that there's something mysterious going on here, but unfortunately he doesn't know why, and he admits that. He's a meticulous researcher, and he's gone to the Library of Congress, to the memoirs of the Founding Fathers, and he understands that Freemasons and other secret fraternities designed not only Washington, D.C., but Philadelphia and all of the European cities, Paris, London, Cologne. These cities are based on an occult pattern, a template, but he doesn't know why. In his book he writes, a survey of the foundation charts used in the building of Washington, D.C. reveals the importance of astrology and indeed confirms beyond doubt that astrology played an important role in the early Masonic rites. The rationale of astrology was rarely discussed openly, even in Masonic documents. Knowledge of the stars, insofar as they were understood in Masonic circles, was preserved as secrets best left to those with specialist knowledge of such things. The extraordinary truth is that the very existence of the Washington Monument is intimately linked with the Egyptian star Sirius, the Sihor that the ancients represented in their sacred hieroglyphics as an obelisk as well as a star. How is it possible that this most important star of the ancient world should find itself, as it were, resurrected in the architecture of the United States? In the course of that day, when the cornerstone of the Washington Monument was laid, the sun would have passed directly over Sirius. And the Declaration of Independence. Oveson says, computations clearly show that on that day, the Declaration of Independence was agreed in Philadelphia. The sun was on Sirius. The Mason who first signed the Declaration of Independence would have been aware of the particular significance of July 4th as a cosmic event. The day was the second of the so-called dog days, which begin on July 3rd. And these so-called dog days are sacred to the Egyptians because it's when the star Sirius is rising to its zenith. In fact, on the moon landing, faked or not, but on that day, again in July, Sirius was at its highest point when the words were being said that the eagle has landed. The star Sirius was brightest in the sky and rising to its zenith. Here we have David Oveson's own words. The dog days are so called because they refer to the rising of the star Sirius. But the word dog here may be a corruption of dag, or dagon, or dragon. In this case, Sirius is not the dog star, but the dragon star, or the star of the dragons. For within a year of Washington's death, it was recognized that the great man should most fittingly be memorialized by means of a massive pyramid. That's right, a massive Egyptian pyramid was the original commemoration of George Washington. The pyramid was already widely used as a symbol in Masonic fraternities in Europe, and we should therefore not be surprised that it should have been proposed in the context of a national symbol guided by so many Freemasons. Whoever was directing the planning of Washington, D.C., not only had a considerable knowledge of astrology, but had a vested interest in emphasizing the role of Virgo, the Virgin. The American Constitution was put before people on September 19th, 1798, in Virgo. Oveson says, the ancient records indicate that it was a practice in former ages for the mystery centers that directed civilization to hand out newly founded cities to the care of specific spiritual beings. The practice of assigning places to the rule of specific zodiacal signs, and thus in medieval times to spiritual beings, is very ancient and has been extended into modern times. Since the discovery of America, we are able to trace most of the sources for the zodiacal rulerships ascribed to the cities of the United States. So what is this man telling us? Suddenly, we're now reading this man's incredible research in the 90s, that cities are ascribed to not only zodiacal signs of the horoscope, of the zodiac, of the stars, but the spiritual beings that rule those energies and rule those stars. Why have we not been told this before? What does it mean? Why is this being found in the memoirs and the documents of the founding fathers of America, senior Freemasons, who not only paid attention to the computations of the heavens when they put in the stone of the Washington Monument in the Capitol building, but who saw to it that the very timings in which these rocks were laid or these stones were placed had significance sidereally. Perhaps it is sufficient, he says, that we recognize as true the medieval arcane notion that such beings could be invited to participate in the life of a city by means of the spiritual art of astrology. Of course, in Latin, these beings are called the cosmocrates, angelic beings, or the angeli motivori. They are beings that move the planets, participating directly in human affairs. For what purpose? For what reason? Oveson says the leader of these mighty beings was due to take over the direction of Western civilization in 1881. This caused considerable excitement in esoteric circles of Washington, D.C. and the occult world in general. Now, in astrology, for those who've done their homework and really researched the esoteric aspects of astrology, two particular signs are of great importance. The northern sign of Cancer and the southern sign of Capricorn face each other, just like you have on the globe, the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer. Now, the Tropic of Cancer, or the northern sign of Cancer, was often called the gate of the souls. Cancer is ruled by the moon, and the moon was considered how the souls enter in to birth. They enter into the planet birth at the time of their birth. They enter in through the moon, through the gate of Cancer, the gate of life. And then when we die and we pass out, mortality, we pass out through the sign of Capricorn, which is ruled by the planet Saturn, which was once attributed to death. So we have the gate of the north and the gate of the south. When we look at different cities, we find that not only do we have this zodiological motif in the architecture, but we often have the piazza, or the center point, which often has a gate at the north and a gate at the south, just like in Vatican City, or in Washington, D.C., or in London, or in Rome, or in Paris. It is also a fact that the Earth is networked with ley lines. These ley lines can often be referred to as dragon paths. Technically, they're called synchronic lines or axiational lines. And as we saw earlier on, Alfred Watkins discovered them, or rediscovered them, at the turn of the century and called them the ley lines. And these are patterns of energy, a great dodecahedron that surrounds the Earth. And it is found by those who study geomancy and feng shui of the Earth that great buildings, cathedrals, churches, and state buildings are often placed at the vertices and key parts, key intersections, key vertices of these ley lines. As Ovison was saying, not only does Washington, D.C. have innumerable zodiacs secreted into it, but many of the different ceremonies and festivals involve the star Sirius. Well, if you go to the Egyptian, you find that when they tried to write the symbol for Sirius, they used a star, a 5-pointed star, a oval, and an obelisk. That's right, they used a pentagram shape, an obelisk, and an oval. Well, isn't that exactly what you see in concrete and marble and granite in the city of Washington? The U.S. Pentagon, the U.S. Monument, and the Oval Office? Why would the whole layout of Washington, D.C. be literally a hieroglyphic in stone of the star Sirius? And it's been noted before that the layout of the central buildings from Shooters Hill onwards, from the Lincoln Memorial and the Capitol Building, are all aligned with the horizon to key celestial events and compass points. Graham Hancock says on this subject, for reasons and motives not yet too clear, the ceremonies, festivities, and city monuments associated with the sister American and French revolutions display Masonic ideas and imagery, and are heavily tinged with Egyptian connotations and symbols. Well, isn't that who the Freemasons were? The word Freemason comes from as early as Egypt, the creators of the pyramids and the Sphinx, the ones who were the workers in stone, the Freemasons. Masons are those who work in stone. Graham Hancock goes on to say, what the American Revolution or War of Independence was much influenced by Freemasons and Masonic ideologies and principles is a well-accepted thesis. Freemasonry was the driving force behind the ideals and tenets of the American Revolution. What is less well known is the fact that there was a very close connection between the French and American Masonic lodges at this time. In those days, Freemasonry in America was regulated by a united Grand Lodge in England, which appointed provincial Grand Masters in various regions of the North American continent. Jean-André Fauchier, a Masonic historian, says, it is certain that the Freemasons of the Nine Sisters Lodge and other lodges who contributed to the collapse of the monarchy and to the success of the revolution were in great numbers. We also have the image of the obelisk, Egyptian obelisks in American cities. And these can be situated in the same way that an acupuncturist uses needles to enhance or to suppress the energies of the physical body. The idea of the Egyptians and the ancient geomancers was to position these statues and these obelisks and these towers at key points of the earth in order to either inflate energy and conduct energy, earth energy, or to suppress energy. Just in the same way, a Chinese doctor will use a needle or will use acupressure to do the same thing for your own body. That is why when you go to certain places where these objects exist, you will feel very good energy at certain places, and you'll feel very peaceful and calm and majestic. And then sometimes when you go to other cities, you have an indescribable feeling of dis-ease and not feel so good. It all has to do with the architecture and the geometry that's involved in the layouts of the cities. But it goes back a long, long way. Thousands and thousands of years before, primitive societies would create the phallic towers in order to transmute the energies of the earth. Washington, D.C. has a large pentagram also involved, and the shape of the owl. There's a large owl in the street plan and the street design. The U.S. Pentagon, we were talking about pentagrams. Well, the U.S. Pentagon is a very important shape and a very important building. It also faces the Egyptian star, Thuban, which used to be the star associated with war. So here we have the U.S. Pentagon actually pointing or facing the ancient star of war, Thuban. It was actually designed or co-designed by John Whiteside Parsons, who's got many secret society connections. He actually helped to design the Pentagon, and he was a high priest in OTO, that's Ordo Templi Orientis, a German Freemasonic lodge, and he was also a close friend of L. Ron Hubbard, the creator of Scientology. And though the Pentagon is very angular, it is actually based on the symbol of the Tudor rose. If you were to soften the edges of the Pentagon just a little, it would bear almost uncannily resemblance for the Tudor rose. And why not? It's the Tudor dynasty who's paying the bills. The Pentagon, if you put the arms back onto a pentagon, you have a pentagram, the great symbol of the star Sirius. And all the military generals wear the symbol of the pentagram. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was raised as a master mason in 1911 at the Holland Lodge No. 8 in New York, and in 1929 became a 33-degree Scottish Rite Freemason at the Albany Consistory. He would have been aware, as were all high-ranking Scottish Rite Masons who had read Albert Pike's Moral and Dogma, that the pentagonal shape, or pentacle, was associated by Pike with the Masonic blazing star, and in turn identified with the five-pointed star of ancient Egypt, Sirius. The groundbreaking ceremony for the Pentagon was on September 11th, 1941. Here is a rendition of the Tudor rose. The Lancasters of England had a red rose as symbol, and the Yorks had a white, just like the old red and white dragons of the Arthurian period. David Ovison goes on to talk about the pentagram. He says, when found in a text, and that also means on a symbol, the star determined or indicated to the reader that the group of hieroglyphics associated with it was related to spiritual matters. It was related to the heavens, to invisible energies, which the Greeks called etheric. So, what's he telling us here? That if you actually see somebody, a general, wearing the symbols of the pentagram, if you see a pentagram on the side of a tank, if you see a U.S. Pentagon shaped like that, if you see a flag, which nearly all the flags of the world contain the five-pointed star, or you see the star on any other thing, chances are it's been put there consciously to represent something etheric, something spiritual, something otherworldly. So here we are in our materialistic world, being taught materialistic philosophy from the time we come out of the womb, told that not to pay attention to anything to do with the occult, and marginalized and sequestered and lambasted if we are, and yet we find out that those in the highest echelons of society are well versed in the most arcane spiritual matters, even to the point of designing the cities in which we live. Here's the Masonic five-pointed star. And of course, the five-pointed star is also connected with other celestial cycles, like the Leviathan cycle, great cosmic cycles. In Paris, we have a literal zodiac leading up to the Champs-Élysées. We have the 12 radiating streets coming to a point. The city is literally designed as a zodiac by French Freemasons. The city of London is situated on the ancient Celtic power points and is divided into 28 boroughs in order to synchronize with the 28 lunar phases. Talking about rituals that go on in the cities, here we have the Great Fire of London, which began on the 2nd of September 1666. The fire started in the house and shop of Thomas Farnior, baker to King Charles II in Pudding Lane. By the way, the Jewish festival of Rosh Hashanah, the Day of Judgment, was only 10 days away. The Great Fire swept over the city of London like a great blowtorch, clearing an area 1.5 miles long and half a mile wide. It destroyed almost everything from Tower Hill in the east to Temple in the west, where it finally burned itself out in front of Temple Church, a distinctive round structure built of stone in the Gothic style. But it is probable that the king was not entirely displeased at this opportunity, for he himself was a bit of a dabbler in town planning and design. Since the Restoration, he had been bitterly frustrated by the lack of funds to transform London into a splendid metropolis that would eclipse the city of light that his cousin, Louis XIV, was turning Paris into. Now here, out of the blue, had come his amazing opportunity that might allow him to do just that. In Graham Hancock's book, Talisman, he speaks about the Fire of London, saying, "A few days after the Great Fire finally abated, Christopher Wren and John Evelyn, each man apparently acting independently, rushed to present Charles II with plans for the full reconstruction of London. To be precise, Wren presented his plan on the 11th of September, 1666. Wow, there's that strange date again, September 11th, 1666. And Evelyn presented his on the 13th of September, 1666. Both men, invisibly, incorporated esoteric symbolic devices into their proposed layouts for the streets and plazas of London, and can only have been done so with the same purpose in mind. Exactly the same symbolic devices, again apparently used for the same purposes, turns up more than a century later on the other side of the Atlantic in the layout for the streets and plazas of Washington, D.C., the newly built capital of the United States of America. It is known that Elias Ashmole was frequently asked by King Charles II to cast horoscopes for various stately functions, and more particularly, after the Great Fire of 1666, to select favorable dates for the layings of the cornerstones of important buildings. Indeed, the tradition of casting horoscopes or selecting propitious astrological dates for the laying of cornerstones of important buildings and monuments was then and remains today a common practice in Freemasonry. Now, we heard in the previous slide that King Charles may have in fact wanted the city to burn down and may have even started the city. After all, it was his baker that the fire started in his baker's shop. And according to Lady Queensborough in her monumental book, Occult Theocracy, Lady Queensborough, who studied the writings of spies that are operating in London, found evidence to say that the fire was in fact started consciously and wasn't just an accident. Lady Queensborough, or Lady Edith Starr Mill, was one of the first writers on the subjects of occult theocracies and secret societies and subversive movements throughout the world. So this is a lady that needs to be read. Her book, Occult Theocracy, goes into that and talks about the Fire of London being by design. One of the other purposes that the ancients made of the dragon paths, the ley lines, or the axiational lines was to commemorate the dead. Many of the ancient stone structures and megalithic sites are actually burial grounds. Not all of them, but some of them are burial grounds. And the same idea transformed and moved over into the modern context. Whenever a great shaman or a great leader or a great master or a great founder of a city or the head of a nation would fall, it was the habit to position their grave or their tomb near one of the major axiational lines or vertices. Monuments of great geometric and geomantic power were constructed to encapsulate the wisdom of a departed serpent. And this process was carried on by both contingents, both the Atlanteans, when one of their champions or heroes or special individuals would fall, they also would intern them at a particular location of the earth grid. And that is why it is when we go to certain places of the world again, we feel a tremendous feeling of spiritual uplift and creative inspiration. And then we go to certain other places and we don't feel the same way. It could also account for the reason why certain places are tranquil and beautiful and have a very powerful vortex, and other places are war-torn and rent with all manner of upheaval. The ancient burial grounds of the serpent masters. Here in Ohio, we have the Ohio serpent, clearly defining the fact that these are commemorated to the serpent people. Here in Avebury, and of course in Ireland, we have the graves of the famous gods of the Gaels. But as I said, the dark side also have their positioning. In fact, the word Capitol comes from Caput Draconis, the head and the tail of the dragon. At Tiahuanaco, according to Inca mythology, it was built in a single night by men who survived the flood. An older legend says that it was built by giants that did not build the city of their own free will, but who were made to do it by beings who came from the sky. It's now time to take a short look at some of the ways that these Nephilim progeny, the descendants of the Atlanteans, have controlled the masses of mankind and how they've gone about activating this great ritual to their dark archons. One of the most powerful Freemasonic symbols is seen here on the left, and it is called the cross and the crown. Around that image we see in Latin, in hoc signe victe, which is in this sign I will conquer, attributed to the Emperor Constantine, one of the founders of Christianity. The cross and the crown. Now, the first international banking empire was created by the Knights Templar with their exploits during the Crusades. Martin Luther's 16th century Protestant Reformation was largely funded by the emerging merchant and banking classes of Germany, who sought to wrest financial control from the papacy. It's also interesting to note that if you go to Wittenberg or you go to Worms and you go and look at the original documents of Martin Luther, you'll find that on the leather-bound covers you'll see the rose cross, the symbols of the Rosicrucians. So here's the person purported to be the founder of a modern Christian religion, and yet he's funded by secret societies and even has their logos on the front covers of his books. The exact same logos that later turn up on the American dollar bill and on the Tudor dynasty. The church exerted a complete stranglehold over all forms of intellectual life and education from early on in its unholy alliance with Rome until the 12th century. The respect for education that was one of the great distinguishing characteristics of the classical Roman Empire was swept away. This is Tim Wallace Murphy in his book Ross Lynn, speaking about the coming of the Dark Ages. Thomas Jefferson also says, the clergy converted the simple teachings of Jesus into an engine for enslaving the world, and adulterated by artificial constructions into a connivance to filch wealth and power to themselves. These clergy, in fact, constitute the real Antichrist. At the top of the crown of the Queen of England, we find the Malta Cross. The Queen is the head of the Knights of Malta, another secret society. And the Nazis, of course, used also the Malta Cross. But this is a very ancient device. The Nazis also used the oak leaves, the skull and bones of the pirates, and the eagle, the old Habsburg symbol, the old skull and bones symbol of the Knights Templar, the Knights of Malta Cross, and the oak leaves of the ancient Druids. Now one might ask, what on earth, again, in the military, in something that has to do with mass death and mass casualty, what are oak leaves doing? On the lapels, we find oak leaves around the hats of the French military. We find them on the lapels of the Russian military. In fact, we find acorns on the hats of the cavalry of the United States of America. Ancient Druidic bardic symbols of theological elites now found on the uniforms of the military mass murderers of the world. That's right. The reason is, as I said, if you're going to sacrifice somebody to the macrobes, you have to mark them for death. You not only have to send a person to the right ritualistic place, but you have to have them dressed for the ritual. The virgin must be dressed for the ritual. They must be marked for death. So you put a bunch of occult symbols on them and send them out to die. The individual just looks in the mirror and thinks they look damn good. But they don't realize what these occult symbols mean. The ribbons and the bells and the whistles and the badges and the emblems of state, the coins, the flags, all the heraldry. It has a meaning in occult theocracy. In America, we have the Ku Klux Klan. This word originally comes from the Greek kuklos, which meant the Knights of the Golden Circle. Now, the Grand Master refers to himself as the dragon. They wear the Knights of Malta cross. They burn crosses, wear white robes like the Knights Templar, and have a racist ideology. And we'll be coming back to the Ku Klux Klan a little bit later. Now, we see the Knights of Malta cross together with the symbol of the dove on the maces of the Queen of England. And it turns out that the Spanish or old word for dove is Columb. That's why we have the District of Columbia, Columbia Pictures and Records, Columbia Shuttle, all the drugs coming from Colombia, South America. We have British Columbia and we have Christopher Columbus. But the word Columbus means the doves. The Knights of Columbus is a secret fraternity run by the Queen of England. It does not represent the Holy Spirit. If we look today on the Visa credit cards on the right-hand side, you'll see the little symbol of the dove. And people never ask, what does this symbol, this so-called holy symbol that's meant to represent the Holy Spirit, what's it doing on the credit cards? Well, it is a dove, but it has nothing to do with the Holy Spirit. It has to do with a secret fraternity known as the Knights of Columbus. The Knights of Malta Cross is also known as the Black Sun. And of course, the Black Sun is the symbol of the Smithsonian Institute in America. And the swastika was even referred to by the Nazis as a black sun. Himmler never got tired of calling the Nazis an order, a lodge, a black lodge. Now the Annunaki, which is the ancient Sumerian word for the fallen angels, is very close to the word Nazi. One of the 8 children of the mother goddess, Ninharsag, Naz, was also refers to Canis Major, a constellation that Sirius occupies. Again, Jesus of Nazareth, from Nasir, meaning Sirius. The Knights of Malta Cross is seen here on the picture on the left in ancient Pictish. These are the Picts of Scotland, using not only the serpent, not only the swastika, but the Knights of Malta Cross. A very ancient symbol. But the fact that we see it here with the serpent is very suggestive. Here again we see it on ancient lances of the Teutonic peoples. Now of course, just like the old Atlanteans, we have the Nazis being very interested in the concept of race and eugenics and genetics, in polygamy and population control. We also have the phenomena of Siamese twins and midgets and deformities and blemishes and the extra nipple and whatnot. Witches were burned for their blemishes. We have congenital hemophilia. We have the ritual of bonding by blood. We have freaks, the whole concept of the Siamese twins that comes down to us, that just put down to us as being freakish, individuals, strange mutations. But could these not be throwbacks to genetic manipulations and genetic experiments that were being done not too far back in our Earth history? Now, Charles Darwin, who wrote Origin of the Species, what we often don't realize is the full title of that book. The full title was Origin of the Species and the Preservation of the Favored Races. Charles Darwin was also funded by occultists, specifically the Royal Academy. Now, Herbert Spencer, the philosopher, while Darwin got the credit, the leading proponent of this chilling racial evolutionary theory was Herbert Spencer, whose ideas were based on race. Spencer was more explicit than Darwin in his conclusion. Only one race was capable of ascending to the highest levels of the evolutionary spiral. The others would be left behind. So here we have an occult agenda of blood, of race, and of mass murder. Because remember, The pontifications of philosophers in the 19th century and of the 20th century are being carried out, they're being implemented in the world. The Nazis implementing occult theocracies coming from occult societies, like the Thule Society and the Freemasons and the occultists of the ancient world, Ordo Templi Orientis. And in America and Britain, it's no different. The Knights Templar, the Knights of Columbus, the Freemasons. The Nazis are steeped, as anyone who studies their symbolism can see, in occultism. They often refer to themselves as the Order of the Black Sun. The official historians now generally accept that occult orders, some very ancient and some new, were operating behind the Nazi Party and other political parties in Germany. The same historians seem conspicuously reluctant, however, to transpose these facts to the British and American political milieu, even when ample evidence exists to prove it, and even when many of the elites of the European occult orders, plus industrialists, publishers, and scholars, were related to international aristocratic families and dynasties. It is a fact that the Vatican helped Hitler to gain power and then helped him to consolidate his grip on Germany. This was done in part by advising the Catholic Party of Germany to vote for the Nazi candidates. The Third Reich is the first power which not only recognizes but puts into practice the high principles of the papacy. This is Franz von Papen, second only in command to Adolf Hitler, is literally telling you that the Third Reich is implementing the principles of the Vatican, the principles of the papacy. But who are the papacy officiating for? Now, of course, when we talk here in programs like this about the Vatican, please understand that we're not talking about Roman Catholicism as a religion. There's a very great difference between Roman Catholicism as a practicing religion and Vatican, the institution of Catholicism, the institution of the Vatican, the nation state, the state within a state. These are two completely different animals here. Behind one of the great thinkers and philosophers behind the Nazi Party, close friend to Rudolf Hess and to Adolf Hitler, was Karl Haushofer. He created what is known as geostrategical theory. He propounded it, and he was the teacher of Rudolf Hess, and Rudolf Hess introduced Haushofer to Adolf Hitler. It's a very important character to study. In the Origins and Oracles series, we have a program called Evil's Willing Servants, and we go into a little bit of Haushofer's background. It makes very interesting listening. One of the most powerful occult societies behind the politics of Germany was called the Thule Society, or the Thule Society, founded in 1912 by Rudolf von Bottendorf, a major Freemason, an expert in Islamic and Oriental mysticism. In 1918, Thule member Karl Harrier forms the Workers' Political Circle, and in 1919 he renames that the German Workers' Party, later headed by Adolf Hitler, who took over from mystic Dietrich Eckart. It became the Nazi Party. Now the word Tula, or Thule, means northerly place or homeland, and it refers to Atlantis. Again, one of the thinkers specifically beloved by Adolf Hitler was called Jorg Lanz, one of the most important of all Nazi ideologists. Jorg Lanz von Liebenfels was an ex-Cistercian monk who published the magazine Ostara. After being expelled from his monastery, he formed his own Order of the New Templars. Adolf Hitler and other Nazis collected and read Ostara and thought of Lanz as a veritable guru. There's the front cover of Ostara, and as you can see, clearly shown there is a Knights Templar. Now, the master race, as they referred themselves to, these terms, we've become so enamored to them, we don't even think anymore what they really mean. Master race. Who are the racialists? Who are those who control the genes of mankind? Who are those who try to separate and segregate the human race based on genetics and eugenics and racial hygiene? Who were the original ones? We see only the Nazis. They're a modern rendition of this ancient problem. They were Satanists who practiced black magic, says Traver Ravenscroft, author of The Spear of Destiny. This means that they were solely concerned with raising their consciousness by means of rituals to awareness of evil and non-human intelligences in the universe, and with achieving means of communication with these intelligences. Now, closer to home, when the tomb of Yale University, that's the tomb of the Skull and Bones secret fraternity, was raided by Christian students, the decor was almost purely Nazi in nature. Maltese crosses, swastikas, and so on were found therein. And the number 322, which is the lodge of the Skull and Bones Society, is actually the German lodge number of this fraternity. It is controlled by German secret societies such as the Illuminati and the OTO and the Thule. And Joel Bakan, in his fine book, The Corporation, says, in its July 1934 issue, Fortune magazine extolled the virtues of fascism and the economic miracles wrought by Mussolini. Lord Goldsborough, the man who produced the issue, wrote, the good journalist must recognize in fascism certain ancient virtues of the race, whether or not they happen to be fashionable in his own country. So there we have it, ties between modern American industrialists and politicians and ancient societies and German occultists. Now, have we been told all along that the ritual sacrifices have been going on? Let's look at the etymology. We've been told that there's a nuclear war. We've been told that there's an atomic war. What do these words actually refer to? What does the word nuclear or nucleus actually refer to? What does the word atomic actually refer to? Does it really refer to reds under the beds and SDI and bombs dropping at you from the skies? Or is it something much closer to home, something slightly more biological, something more of a Cold War, one that would never heat up at all? And what are the Star Wars? And now that the ritual centers have been designed and built, and now that the masses of the population live in the cities of the world, the next stage is easy. All the unrest, all the slaughter, all the mayhem, all the bloodletting, from the Holocaust to the assassinations. We have in Ireland, for instance, tremendous unrest there, constant unrest in Palestine, in Guyana, in Waco, in Heaven's Gate, in Columbine school disaster, in Oklahoma city bombing, or the Twin Towers or the Gulf War. All these traumas visited upon members of the human race. In Waco, the great comedian Bill Hicks said, if child molestation is actually your concern, then how come we don't see Bradley tanks knocking down Catholic churches? Now, since the Second World War, the U.S. has bombed 250 countries. That's actually since 1948, which was the time of the creation of the United Nations. Anthony J. Hilder of Radio Free World says there have been more wars since the creation of the United Nations in 1948 than from the beginning of time up until 1948. Now, who are the United Nations, and were they really created to instigate peace in the world anyway? Well, their history is that they were previously called the League of Nations, and they came into existence through Roosevelt's Bretton Woods Agreement. But before they were called the League of Nations, they were called the League to Enforce the Peace. Previous to that, they were called the American Society for the Judicial Settlement of International Disputes. Now, this society was created in 1920 by Theodore Marburg, and its first chairman was William Howard Taft of the Skull and Bones Society. Secretaries of War of the U.S. are commonly Skull and Bones members, right up to the modern day. And Geneva is home to the League of Nations and to the Bilderberger Group. Concerning the slaughter and mayhem, Count Leo Tolstoy, the great author, said that government is an association of men who do violence to the rest of us. How right he is. And Manly Palmer Hall, one of America's greatest and most beloved occultists, also a 33rd degree Mason, puts it this way: to repress rebellion is to maintain the status quo, a condition which binds the mortal creature in a state of intellectual or physical slavery. But it is impossible to chain man merely by slaving his body. The mind must also be held, and to accomplish this, fear is the accepted weapon. The common man must fear life, fear death, fear God, and fear devil, and fear most his overlords, the keepers of his destiny. So it goes for urban life. And now Aldous Huxley, in his book, The Final Revolution, one of the people very much into control of the masses, writes, "There will be, in the next generation or so, a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude and producing dictatorships without tears, so to speak. Producing a kind of painless concentration camp for entire societies so that people will in fact have their liberties taken away from them, but will rather enjoy it, because they will be distracted from any desire to rebel by propaganda, brainwashing, or brainwashing enhanced by pharmacological methods. And this seems to be the final revolution." That's right. As the Nazis had a final solution for their victims, so these thinkers and potentates and politicians, they're working on the final solution for the rest of us. But we're going to enjoy it, of course. Now, one of the major occultists in Europe was called Count Cagliostro, and he was one of the individuals also working on the Stargate problem. His real name was Giuseppe Balsamo, and he was a ruthless and a very enigmatic character. And being a Freemason, he actually invented one of Freemasonry's rites. It's called Cagliostro's Egyptian rite. But this involved a virginal boy or girl as an oracle, or even as a priest. And these virgins were known in Masonic circles as the Columb, or the doves. So here we have Cagliostro's Egyptian rite, a rite that involves virginal boys or girls in the form of the priest or the oracle. But they're known by the name the doves. And the Spanish for that is Columb. So anybody remember Columbine High School and the sacrifices of the young children there? Were they oracles too, in some sort of Masonic rite? We have Applewhite and the priesthood of Saturn. Saturnian symbolism is also very prevalent in Freemasonry. And this particular Heaven's Gate cult, the very word Heaven's Gate, we already looked earlier at Saturn and the gate of the south, which is a correspondence of death. And the fact that they wore black attire and the Nike logo. The Nike logo is actually the corner of the rings of Saturn. And the fact that the men in Heaven's Gate were castrated. Anyone who studied ancient mythology knows that Saturn and the sickle of Saturn and the castration of his father Uranus, all of these symbols coming out of the ancient world. Now, large doses of fear, trepidation, and agony were released during the 9/11 episode, not only from New York, but all over the world. This event was staged at the site of a powerful vortex or synchronic line. So yes, as part of the great rituals and traumas, we're not going to have just one event. We're going to have assassinations, we're going to have murders, we're going to have rapes and serial crimes. We're going to have Zodiac killers and Green River killers and Night Stalkers and all kinds of disaster. We're going to have children burned up with CS gas at Waco and all other manner of atrocities that one could possibly think of, that the human mind in its depravity could come up with. 9/11 is just one of those events. But any of these events, if they're situated at the right place and at the right time, create waves that permeate into the earth grid and permeate the lives of individuals. That's what cities were originally designed for. There's nothing natural about a city. There's nothing natural about living in one. Assassinations like that of Diana, the moon goddess, on August 31st. And August 31st is the period when the constellation known as Virgo descends beneath the horizon. So the Virgin descending beneath the horizon signifies the time of sacrifice. In fact, August 31st, 100 years prior, was when Jack the Ripper killed his first virgin, or his first whore. Another ritual sacrifice. November 22nd, 1963. At Sagittarius, the point of Sagittarius, the famous 13th sign of the zodiac, is the assassination of John F. Kennedy at the junction of 3 roads on November 22nd. That's 11 for November and 22 for the day. That's 33. He was also shot at the 33rd meridian of the Earth at the junction of 3 roads. And he was murdered at the period between the signs of Sagittarius and Scorpio. And this is known as the 13th sign of the zodiac. Only those who study the occult, esoteric form of astrology know this, the famous 13th sign of the zodiac. And the secret society, or the secret bodyguard, the secret police meant to be protecting John F. K., referred to him by the code name the Traveler. But in fact, that's an ancient mythological name. Exactly at the point when the sun god descends into the underworld, he was known in all ancient times as the Traveler. Speaking of this kind of geometry, Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval write, the geographical latitude of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount lies between the 31st and 32nd degree parallels, with the latter passing just south of the Holy City. It has also been remarked that the Mother Lodge of the Scottish Rite Supreme Council of the 33rd degree was located in the city of Charleston in South Carolina, probably because the 33rd degree parallel passes right through it. So even though it may seem strange, even preposterous to us, these secret societies pay attention not only to sidereal time, not only to calendar dates, not only the movement of the luminaries and the stars, but also to the degrees of longitude and latitude of the Earth, from the dropping of the atom bomb, to assassinations here, to openings of buildings there. These sidereal times are very, very important, as the great scholars are now starting to find out. And this particular thing about the 33rd meridian, why are so many of the world's banks, why are so many of the world's wars, why are so many of the stately homes of the world, and specifically the banks, are situated on the 30th, between the 30th and 33rd parallel of the Earth? But we have wars, and we have rumors of wars, and we have endless anxiety. Large doses of fear and confusion make excellent business, especially for the pharmaceutical monopolies. Consumption of antidepressants rose dramatically after the attack on the World Trade Center. As Emperor Caligula is meant to have said, let them hate us as long as they fear us. Fear, of course, as Huxley and as Manly Palmer Hall are saying, is the best way to control. Since love and fear can hardly exist together, says Machiavelli, and if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved. So this is the kind of mentality in these new Atlanteans, the ones who seek to control us and keep us roped in, dumbed down, ignorant, impoverished, not to be made privy to what the masters are doing behind the scenes, behind the veil of government and national security. Now, F.T. Marinetti is a great study when it comes to studying mania. The founder of the Italian Futurism and a lifelong fascist, he was also one of the most influential personages in the history of modern art. In his Futurist Manifesto of 1909, he says, war is beautiful because it initiates the dreamt of metallization of the human body. War is beautiful because it enriches a flowering meadow with fiery orchids of machine guns. War is beautiful because it combines the gunfire, the cannonades, the ceasefire, the scents, and the stench of putrefaction into a symphony. We will glorify war, the world's only hygiene. Militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of freedom, brings beautiful ideas worth dying for, and scorn for women. We will destroy the museums, libraries, academies of every kind. We will fight moralism, feminism, every opportunistic or utilitarian cowardice. Makes one think of the movie Dr. Strangelove, this kind of mania loose in the world. Not some psychotic, though. Not somebody who's been locked up in a, asylum somewhere. These are the top thinkers of the world. People whose thoughts and manifestos change how we think and act. Herman Kahn, in his On Thermonuclear War in 1960, calmly considers whether or not a death toll of 50 million human beings would be an acceptable, quote-unquote, statistic to ensure that democracy prevails. Jordan Maxwell and some other scholars who study the astrological cycles and chart what these evilarchies are up to, and once you know what they're into, then you can sort of follow what they're up to and get ahead of the game. We've come to understand that we're in what we call the Saturnalian period, or what they call the Saturnalian period, when chaos and debauchery is permissible. We're in what the Hindus call the Kal age, and what also might be called the Dionysian age, when all forms of debauchery and depravity are let loose upon the world. This is the period when all kinds of virtue and morality, as the ancient texts were saying, are thought of as vices. Julian Huxley, in the preface to Brave New World, says, as political and economic freedom diminishes, sexual freedom tends to compensatingly increase, and the dictator will do well to encourage that freedom, in conjunction with the freedom to daydream under the influence of dope, movies, and radio. It will help to reconcile his subjects to their servitude, which is not their fate. In Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, he writes, sensual pleasures programmed into people as infants through hypnopedic messages repeated thousands of times as they slept. These messages encouraged sexual promiscuity, attendance at mass entertainments, and the ingestion of drugs for any and every unpleasant feeling or little distress. You know, the idea here is not to have people actually have more sex, but to engender frustration that they're not able to. In George Orwell's 1984, An Animal Farm, he says, the past is completely eliminated. History is revised. Books are destroyed. Without print media, there is no evidence that anything has been different. Even keeping diaries is forbidden. People are expected to absorb and accept the new information delivered by the television sets, even if it directly contradicts the news of a month ago. Since it is impossible to prove the contradiction, it is useless to try to resist. And is this not the exact situation we find ourselves in today, where people not only believe the media, but in believing it, they're filled with contradictions? But who stands up to right those contradictions? If something on the media repeats and repeats and repeats the same message, eventually 80% of the population just blithely accept it. In the book Being Human, we read, when faced with a life-threatening situation, the reptilian hindbrain, the most primitive part of the human brain, switches off all activity except that which keeps us alive. It sends the subconscious message, do not move, breathe, or blink, or you will be seen and attacked. But as Hesiod, and the ancient Greek playwright in 8th century BC, he writes, the gods keep mankind ignorant of the ways of living, else one would do enough in one day to last a year. In Job 12, the Bible, we read, he increaseth the nations and destroyeth them. He enlargeth the nations and straighteneth them again. In Job 12, he taketh away the heart of the chief of the people of the earth, and causeth them to wander in a wilderness where there is no way. They grope in the dark, without light, and him maketh to stagger like a drunken man. So we have it in the age of Dionysus, the Kal age. And who are the philosophers who brought this about? Well, Thomas Malthus, in his own words, says, in his essay on population, instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. We should crowd more people into the houses and court the return of the plague. But above all, we should reprobate specific remedies for ravaging diseases. And those benevolent but mistaken men who have thought that they were doing a service to mankind by projecting schemes for the total extirpation of particular disorders. If by these and similar means the annual mortality were increased, we might possibly, every one of us, marry at the age of puberty, and yet few be absolutely starved. When we come to eugenics and Charles Darwin, he writes in his own words, excepting in the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. Eugenics, which was selective breeding or racial hygiene, is not, however, a Nazi or a German phenomena, but a British and American one. Hundreds of people were systemically and legally sterilized in the United States from 1907 on. The most influential eugenicist was Sir Francis Galton, the cousin of Charles Darwin. He was an honorary president of the Eugenics Society for several years. His successor was Major Leonard Darwin, son of Charles Darwin, and it was he who strongly promoted the eradication of the unfit. The first U.S. Eugenics Society was headed by Averell Harriman, mother. It was also funded by the royals, as was the entire Harriman dynasty. Ernst Rudin, Hitler's eugenics expert and chief engineer, was a guest of Mrs. Harriman in America before the advent of the Second World War. In 1905, Dr. Ernst Rudin founded a German eugenics society called the Society for Racial Hygiene. Later he changed the name, adding the word suggested by Francis Galton, the Society for Racial Hygiene, that is, eugenics. In 1925, Leonard Darwin wrote an article for the Journal of the Eugenics Society, the Eugenics Review, pushing the idea of locking up everyone whose genes might be considered defective. To save the human race, he said, force or compulsion would be necessary in many cases. He promoted a policy that he called segregation, but he did not mean segregating whites from blacks. He meant separating the fit from the unfit. Compulsion is now permitted if applying to criminals, lunatics, and mental defectives, and this principle must be extended to all who, by having offspring, would seriously damage future generations, he argued. The leaders of the progressive movement in Britain also supported negative eugenics. The people who had founded the London School of Economics at Sydney and Beatrice Webb were also leaders of the Fabian Society. The Fabian Society later became one of Britain's major political parties, the Labour Party. As early as 1909, the Fabians, led by the Webbs, said, "What we as eugenicists have got to do is to scrap the old poor law with its indiscriminate relief of the destitute as such and replace it by an intelligent policy of so altering the social environment as to discourage or prevent the multiplication of those irrevocably below the national minimum of fitness." In 1930, a Fabian leader, Archibald Church, introduced a bill for eugenic sterilization. So here we have the Fabians, here we have top politicians, here we have the founder of evolution theory, the elites of British society, deciding who will live and who will not, and the manner in which they will administer the torture to the unfit. The Fabian Society itself was founded in 1883 and played a catalytic role, preaching the inevitability of gradualness in the movement towards a socialist society, taking their name from the Roman warrior Fabius, who learned to wait patiently before striking a fatal blow against Hannibal. In America, John Foster Dulles, Senator and Secretary of State under Eisenhower, has this to say: "It is only by eliminating the lower members of the human race that the higher average is maintained." And Jacques Cousteau, UNESCO Courier, on November 1991 said, "The United Nations goal is to reduce population selectively by encouraging abortion, forced sterilization, and control human reproduction, and regards 2/3 of the human population as excess baggage, with 350,000 people to be eliminated per day." And the master of them all, Bertrand Russell, in his Impact of Science on Society, had this to say: "At present, the population of the world is increasing at about 58,000 per diem. War so far has had no very great effect on this increase, which continued throughout each of the world wars. War has hitherto been disappointing in this respect, but perhaps bacteriological war may prove effective. If a Black Death could spread throughout the world in every generation, survivors could procreate freely without making the world too full. The state of affairs might be unpleasant, but what of it?" We have Prince Philip, quoted in the Deutsche Presse Agentur in August 1988, said, "In the event I am reborn, I would like to return as a deadly virus in order to contribute something to solve overpopulation." Now, the Institute of Human Virology, we read that according to top pharmacologist Dr. Robert B. Strecker, MD, PhD, the leading scientist of the project, that AIDS virus was created at Fort Detrick, but was based on research first conducted at the Lebedev Institute near Moscow, which was founded by the world's leading virologist, Gurvich. The number of those infected doubles every month. Over 23 million Americans are already affected. In the Strecker Memorandum, In the 30s and 40s, the Public Health Service openly experimented and monitored black men infected with syphilis in Tuskegee, Alabama. Even after penicillin was discovered, these men remained infected and were not treated. Hence, their wives and sons were likewise infected. These incidents are recorded in detail in the book Bad Blood by James Jones. Between 1959 and 1970, there were over 300 biological experiments conducted on U.S. citizens unbeknownst to them. The extent of the program is revealed in the book A Higher Form of Killing by Paxman and Harris. That's from Dr. Robert Strecker's The Strecker Memorandum. Now here it is on DVD. This Dr. Robert Strecker, conclusively proves that AIDS was vector-borne, that AIDS was a man-made designer disease to create havoc in the world, exactly according to the policies of Bertrand Russell and Aldous Huxley and his coterie. This is absolute compulsory viewing. The Strecker Memorandum by Dr. Robert Strecker. He was one of the first people to work on the AIDS virus and knows everything there is to know about it. In The Final Revolution, Aldous Huxley says, "It seems to me perfectly in the cards that a euphoric drug, far more efficient and less harmful than alcohol, may be produced. And if this should be introduced into every bottle of Coca-Cola, then clearly, as I ventured to point out more than 25 years ago in Brave New World, this would become an incredibly powerful instrument in the hands of a dictator. What is becoming, I think, quite clear now is that dictatorships of the future probably will not be based on terror, as the dictatorships of Hitler and Stalin. Terror is an extremely wasteful, stupid, and inefficient method of controlling people. In Brave New World, the distribution of this mysterious drug, which I called a soma, was a plank in the political platform. A Dr. Wright refers to inoculation against smallpox in the British Isles as an ancient practice. And a citizen of Wales, aged 99 years old, states that inoculations had been known and used during his entire lifetime, but that she got smallpox through her inoculation. In Birmingham, England, from 1871 to 1874, there were 7,706 cases of smallpox. Out of these, 6,795 had been vaccinated against the disease. A select committee of the Privy Council convened to inquire into the Vaccination Act of 1867. As 97.5% of those vaccinated died of the disease. Now, Dr. Charles Crichton, in 1884, he is asked to write an article for the Encyclopedia Britannica on vaccination. After much research internationally, he concludes that vaccination constituted a gross superstition. In 1896, Italian professor Carlo Ruta states that vaccination is a worldwide delusion and an unscientific practice with consequences measured today with tears and sorrow without end. Joseph Lister introduced sanitation to the surgery and hospital, but was fiercely resisted by leading surgeons and doctors. The British Medical Association dedicated itself to attacking his name, reputation, and theories. In 1850, a British physician reads a paper detailing the microscopic examination of food products, revealing that all food products examined in Britain were adulterated with foreign substances, including chemicals. W.B. Clark from the New York Press in 1909 says, "Cancer was practically unknown until the cowpox vaccination began to be introduced." He says, "I have seen 200 cases of cancer, and I never saw a case of cancer in an unvaccinated person." On the question of fluoride, in 1943, researchers from the U.S. Public Health Service examined the health of the residents of Bartlett, Texas, to see if the 8 parts per million of fluoride in their drinking water was affecting their health. It was checked again in 1953. They find that the death rate in Bartlett was 3 times higher than a neighboring town which contained only 0.4 parts per million of the fluoride. Dr. James W. Wardner, in his book Unholy Alliances, says, "The London Office of Strategic Affairs," that's the OSS from which developed the CIA, was run by David K. E. Bruce, an employee of Averell Harriman from the 1920s. Through Bruce and other connections, Averell Harriman dominated all American intelligence functions in wartime Britain. David Bruce was the husband of a Pittsburgh Mellon heiress. Alan Dulles had been the player for the Mellons' big international oil ventures, and eventually the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell took over the management of the entire Mellon family fortune. It was through the Mellons that fluoride began to be promoted and dispensed into the America's water supply. Now, Ghislaine Langtot, in her book The Medical Mafia, writes, at a CIA hearing, Dr. Gottlieb, a cancerologist, admitted having dispersed in 1960 a large quantity of viruses in the Congo River in Zaire to pollute and contaminate all the people who used the river as their source of water. Dr. Gottlieb was named to be the head of the National Cancer Institute. François Mitterrand, the president of France, says, the health of citizens is a commodity which is bought and sold. And mind control advocate Dr. Jose Delgado, in his book Physical Control of the Mind Towards a Psycho-Civilized Society, simply puts it this way: man does not have the right to develop his own mind. Now, the annual death toll from synthetic prescription drugs, both from the correctly prescribed and the incorrectly prescribed, amounts to about 231,000 deaths every year. To put this into perspective, this is the equivalent of a World Trade Center disaster every week for over a year and a half, or the crash of 2 fully loaded 747 aircraft every day of the year. Drug deaths caused by physicians, the third leading cause of death in the United States. It is far ahead of accidents, drunk driving, homicides, airline accidents, as well as all other disease. Jimmy Carter says, doctors collectively have done more to block adequate medical care for people of this country than any other single group. And Linus Pauling, the Nobel laureate, says, everyone should know that the war on cancer is largely a fraud. Now, it turns out that the term or word Medici, refers to the 13th century Florentine patrician family who became one of the most powerful bankers as well as patrons of the arts and who provided many tyrannical popes. This word, the Medici, actually comes from that, meaning medical doctors. So again, here we have the age-old connection, coming down from the Venetians, coming down from the Phoenicians, coming down from the ancient Sumerians. We have the families related, descended by blood from these ancient sources. And they're still up to their business, right down into modern times, massacring, creating rituals, treating people as if they're just cattle ready for sacrifice. Alice Bailey, an occultist and head of the Lucius Trust, she says, behind the division of humanity stand those enlightened ones whose right and privilege it is to watch over human evolution and to guide the destinies of men. This they do through the implanting of ideas in the minds of the world thinkers, so that these ideas in due time receive recognition and eventually become controlling factors in human life. They train the members of the new group of world servers in the task of changing these ideas into ideals. These in turn become the desired objectives of the thinkers and are then taught to the powerful middle class and worked up into world forms of governments or religion, thus forming the basis of the new world order. And Sidney West, the leader of the Fabian Society that later became the Labour Party of England, has this to say about the whole gig. To play those millions of minds, to watch them slowly respond to unseen stimulus, to guide their aspirations without their knowledge, all this, whether in high capacities or in humble, is a big and endless game of chess of ever extraordinary excitement. So-called philanthropist John D. Rockefeller, in his occasional letter number 1 of the General Educational Board, has this to say, in our dreams we have limitless resources, and people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. Unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill on a grateful and responsive rule of folk. The task we set before ourselves is a very beautiful one, to train these people as we find them to a perfectly ideal life just where they are. And Major John Rawling Rees of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, a major mind control syndicate in England, says this: the patient must remain unaware of the specific intentions and purposes of the doctor administering the treatment. Building a society in which it is possible for any member of any social group to be treated without resort to legal means, and even if they do not desire such treatment.